Hey everyone, I wanted to go ahead and do another video. Today I'm kind of going to continue what I talked about in my last video where I talked about sound and talked about my struggle with sound and my journey along the way to get to where I sound like I wanted to on the saxophone. And today I want to talk about one of my musical heroes, and I think if anybody who knows me knows how much I love Coltrane, John Coltrane. And, his sound is sort of the big shadow that looms over me whenever I'm thinking about playing the saxophone or thinking about jazz or even music in general. When I was younger, I was only focused on playing jazz. And as I've gotten older, I've broadened my horizons a lot, into other styles of music. And that's really the topic of another video where I could talk about how Coltrane influenced me in that kind of way. But today I want to continue talking about like saxophone sound and saxophone mechanics and how we approach playing the horn, playing the tenor. And today I want to talk about the big sort of a big revelation I had. Not really a revelation, but more of a observation, I guess you could say, I had about his music and his playing, with regard to this dichotomy in his music between the soprano and the tenor. So one of the big things for me is kind of examining how his sound and his playing changed throughout his career. And I always thought people had a very simple view of it, which is understandable. His discography is very big and wide, and there's a lot of things to pour over there. There's a lot of information, a lot of music to dissect, and not everybody had, I should say, prior to my lifetime. Not everybody had the privilege of being able to, at a moment's notice, no pun intended, being able to explore his entire discography whenever they wanted to. It was very hard to find every record that he appeared on or every recording. Even when someone like Lewis Porter was writing his book about Coltrane, he probably he had to go and find a CD or a record or something of a recording, and a lot of things were hard to find. Nowadays everything's on Spotify and you can just listen to it whenever, and I'm very fortunate that that's the case, because it's led me to make a lot of discoveries and observations about his music, and I've had a change of perspective of his music multiple times, and one of these big ones has come in the last couple of years, with regards to his, how I think the soprano and the way he played the soprano saxophone and the way he played the tenor saxophone. Sorry, I just keep kicking this table that my tripod is standing on. I'm really going to try to stop doing that. I'm sorry. Is how those two things have, the soprano and the tenor, kind of affected each other. So this kind of started for me when I was listening to his entire discography all the way through, with a friend of mine a couple years ago. I think this was in the second half of 2022, which was a year where I spent a lot of time playing my instrument, not a lot of time practicing, but I was gigging a lot and I was playing a lot at home. I was really putting everything I had into the saxophone. And I was listening to a lot of Coltrane at this time, and I kind of always would go through phases where I'd listen to different periods. I'd spend a lot of time, like for example, when I was in college, when I was a junior and senior in college, I really spent a lot of time with his 50s recordings, like the Prestige records, particularly records like Lush Life or Setting the Pace. I really liked those records. Blue Train was another one, Giant Steps. I listened to those a lot because I was really kind of young in my jazz learning at that time, and I wanted to really just learn how to play basic shit, just learn how to play basic tunes, right? And a lot of those records are just standards, and I loved the way he approached playing standards and songs, the way he would play melodies in a very very loose but still respecting the melody kind of way. Anyway, I used to listen to that period a lot, and then I would switch over and listen to his late period at other times. His late period was kind of what got me into his music, listening to the more free stuff, like when I was in high school. And so I was having this problem where I wanted to sift through everything and hear everything as it changed. Hear every recording from record to record in order of like not just like when they came out, but when they were recorded based on like the sessions. I wanted to hear, every change where I could. And as with any complex artists, the more you stare at their work or listen to their music, you often end up with more questions than you do answers. And and I listened to every one of his records, and I ended up coming away with a handful of like quandaries or observations that led to more questions and more things to think about, which is great. His music is very thought-provoking, and no matter what period it is, I still listen to some of his records and go, why did he do that? Like, why did he play that like that? Why did he do this tune in this key? Why did he choose to play this like this? And one of these came when I was listening to Live at Birdland with a friend of mine, which is a record I had not listened to so much because, in the past I was a little immature and I would tend to skip over the recordings where he would play soprano. I was more interested in the tenor sound and his tenor playing. I wanted to hear him play tenor. I didn't really care that much about the soprano. I didn't really play that much soprano myself until very recently. And so I started listening more to his soprano stuff because I wanted to get acclimated to it. And the reason I started doing this is because, like I said, I was listening to Live at Birdland. And when you go from the first track, which I believe is Afro Blue, where he plays soprano, he goes to the second track, I Want to Talk About You. And almost immediately I was taken aback because I didn't recognize at first that he had switched from soprano to tenor. Now those songs probably weren't even played like back to back on that gig, for all I know. They could have been played in any order, but still it made an impression on me. I was like, wow, his tenor sound and his soprano sound have kind of become one by this point in his career. And that kind of was like a light bulb for me. And that was, that album Live at Birdland is interesting because I feel like probably of all his records, that one has the highest ratio of soprano to tenor playing on it. Maybe that one, and I'm trying to think of another one. Favorite Things is like 50-50. Half the songs are soprano. But this one is like, there's like 5 tracks, and on 3 of them, he plays soprano, and 2 of them he plays tenor. And I thought that was very interesting. And so I kind of started analyzing this. I started thinking about his sound, and I kind of noticed some things about his soprano playing. I noticed how on the soprano he would play different things than on the tenor, and then vice versa, and how his sound was kind of changing. And this led me to start practicing more soprano myself because I wanted to feel for myself like what the implications of like these 2 horns, practicing them and playing different types of songs on them. And I noticed that on soprano he might play more chromatic stuff, even more like outside kind of dissonant, very fast passages. It's almost like the sheets of soundy things that he was playing before, like in the late 50s and early 60s, moved. He took them from the tenor to the soprano. Because on the tenor, I feel like a lot of the time in the 60s, he didn't play like as much of that stuff. He would still play it a little bit. There's no like black and white with Coltrane. Everything was always happening at the same time, always, anywhere. But I noticed that the soprano kind of took the lead in terms of the kind of outside, more exotic sounds that he would play. And I think that's also because of the type of music he would play on that instrument. He would play the waltzes and the stuff that had like a kind of a world music vibe. A lot of that would be played on soprano. Like he'd play Favorite Things or Green Sleeves, or later he'd do Chim Chim Cheree. There's a song I really like on Live at Birdland called Your Lady, where he plays soprano. That's a great one. And I started to think about this, and I started to notice how, to me, there's like this weird change in his tenor sound, right? if you look at his playing in the 50s, he starts out with Miles sounding a lot like Dexter or someone like that. He has a very broad and dark sound. The sound eventually gets a little bit brighter, toward the end, like towards Giant Steps, but it's still kind of a big, kind of wide, tenor-y sound. It's not too different from some of the other people who were around at the time. It's definitely different and very distinct, definitely brighter than someone like Sonny Rollins or whatever, but it's not too different in my opinion. It's still kind of very much, he sounds like he in the vein of a traditional kind of saxophone player. And then it changes in the 60s. His sound gets a little bit more like brighter and it's the focus changes a little bit. Like if you listen to the way he sounds on Ballads or the 1962 self-titled album or the album with Duke Ellington, his sound is a little different. It's a little more squeezed, it's a little almost harsher, I think. It doesn't have the broadness and the readiness that his playing had, even in like 1960 on something like Coltrane's Sound or something like that. And I think this had a lot to do with the way he approached the soprano and the tenor. And my thinking was at the time was that, to him, it's not. To him, the two instruments are part of the same thing. And when he switches from tenor to soprano, for example, he's just kind of thinking of one as an extension of the other. The soprano is just the higher notes of the tenor that you can't reach. The tenor is the lower notes of the soprano you can't reach. They're both in B flat, so they have this overlap. It's not like going to tenor and alto where they're in different keys, so the fingerings are different, and you really do have to change the way you think about like the transposition and the way you hear things. The soprano can just be like, if you hear things on the tenor more naturally, the soprano can be just an extension of that, almost like applying an octave pedal, to your tenor, right, making it higher. And of course, with Coltrane, you have to kind of imagine things because he was not a person who ever talked about things with anybody for that much. That in depth. We don't have a lot of recorded interviews with him. He wasn't a very vocal person. We have to kind of gather things from bits and pieces. We have to really, listen to the music and let the music speak for itself and make assumptions based on what's going on musically. So for me, back when I was going through this phase, I started practicing soprano. I started playing and trying to figure this out on my own. I even bought like a new soprano mouthpiece that was like the same as the mouthpiece I was playing on tenor at the time. And I was really trying to make the two horns one. And I would do gigs where I would play more soprano than tenor if I could. I would try to play but I also try to play certain songs on soprano, whereas certain songs would be tenor only, Like I remember I used to play the song Nardis on soprano a lot, and I used to play very chromatic things on that tune, whereas if I'm playing on the tenor, I might be playing more like very pentatonic and very like melodically on that tune, for example. Those are just a couple things, and that was sort of my big revelation at the time, was that his tenor and soprano, they were almost like unified in a way. And then it changed in 1964 and 65. He stopped playing the soprano as much. He would only play it on like Favorite Things. He might do Favorite Things or Afro Blue, but he would do concerts where the rest of it was his tenor songs. He would do Talk About You, or he would do Impressions, or anything else. And his tenor sound changed. If you listen to his tenor sound on Crescent, it's darker and it's broader and it's wider, and it's got a different character. And the music began to shift a little bit. He moved away from some of the things he was doing before into these more open structures, and he was playing the tenor a lot more. And his tenor sound, I think, got a lot darker. If you listen to, the stuff toward the end of his life, his sound is his tone is completely different. There's a lot of vibrato. It's very dark. It's almost lush. Like if you listen to the way he sounds on Interstellar Space, that's a very lush, like that type of sound would almost make Coleman Hawkins blush. In fact, there is a in the book, it's either in the book Chasing the Train by J.C. Thomas, or it's in the John Coltrane book by Bill Cole. There's a quote from Ben Harrod. Ben Harrod used to be the guy who worked at Autolink and would work on mouthpieces at Autolink. And there's a quote from him where he said that Coleman Hawkins came to Autolink in like the mid 60s, like maybe 64, 65. And he said, you need to give me whatever John Coltrane is playing on, because that guy's going to have a bigger sound than me someday. And so that's kind of funny, because that kind of confirmed, in a way, like a line of thought that I had. And so going back to the soprano thing, I had another one of those confirmations of a line of thought that I had in this book. I was reading this interview book of Coltrane, which I've had for a little while, but I actually never sat down and read the whole thing. I always just kind of assumed that most Coltrane interviews like wouldn't be that interesting or that in-depth, because some of them are very short. You know, there's only a few examples of him sitting down with somebody for a long time, and he didn't talk about things in a very like explanatory way. You know, he was a very folksy person. Like, if you listen to him explain something, he's very down to earth. You know, he would have never done a YouTube video like this where he talks in a very almost like analytic kind of way. He probably would have never done anything like that. But if you read this book, there's a couple tidbits every now and then of some really good information, and I stumbled across a couple of them that kind of confirmed what I was thinking about the soprano. So let me see if I can find this. So let's see. Okay, so you said once that you would have. This is from an interview with. Let me find the interviewer. I think this is. It's a French interview. Let's see. I guess Michel Delorme. Let me see. Those guys, if you can read it. Oh, you definitely can't read that. But it's in the interview that starts on page 169, and what I'm reading is on page 176. So definitely get this book. It's worth reading. So you said once that you have to decide one day between the soprano and the tenor. Might one know what will be your decision? So I think he does talk, I forget exactly where in this book, but that is something that's mentioned. And this interview is from 1962, so it's right in that time period I'm talking about. Coltrane says, I haven't solved that problem yet. The soprano requires a particular way of holding the lips. It requires more muscles than the tenor, and because of that, one's lips get hurt quickly. If I develop the habit of playing very tight, my embouchure will maybe become too tight for tenor. That's the problem. That could happen soon. In fact, I'm sure it will happen. I've been playing soprano for about 2 years, and the first symptoms are already appearing. It's these technical difficulties, and only them, that will require me to choose the instrument that I will have to play in the future. Clearly, the soprano is well worth the loss of my embouchure for the tenor, but it's nevertheless that finally I will choose the tenor. No, really, I can't answer your question with any certainty. So obviously, that interview probably was translated from French back to English at some point, or it was, written, paraphrased, whatever. But that's kind of revealing when you think about it. And then, of course, you think about Coltrane told Frankowski in 1966 about how he was struggling with his tenor mouthpiece, and he got his mouthpiece worked on, and he didn't like how it sounded. I mean, that kind of comports with what I'm saying here is, his sound really changed because of that horn, and he started to think of things differently. Let me see. And there's another one on page 191, different interview. This whole section is titled Soprano versus Tenor. He says, the interviewer says, one of the things that we talked about last year is you said one day or another I have to make a choice between the soprano and the tenor. And then Coltrane says, and I feel like this interview is a little bit more reflective of what he actually thought, because I feel like this is more direct of what he probably said. I'd forgotten I'd said that, but I guess it was very fresh in my mind then. And it's still a problem, and it hasn't been solved. It seems now that I'm fighting to stay with the tenor because I don't want to lose it. But the soprano is so easy to pick up and play, like in my room or when I'm traveling. I find it's the easiest one to have at hand, And often, more than not, I find myself playing it. And most of the ideas that I get come from the sound in that range of the instrument. And I still like it very much, but I feel that I want to go back to the tenor, more or less. because actually the soprano is about my favorite instrument ever since I picked it up. And now I'm beginning to get used to it, and I want to go and strengthen myself on the tenor again. I've got to change on tenor because it's about time to change mouthpieces, you know. When the tour is over, I'm going to go to Paris and go down to the Selmer Company. And if things work out as I hope they might, I might have a new combination of mouthpiece and horn that will give me something that will rekindle a new interest in the tenor, you know. At least that's what I'm hoping for. In the soprano saxophone, the soprano saxophone has really begun to be my favorite, but I don't think it can take the place of the tenor in my life because it doesn't have the power that the tenor has, you know. And I think that kind of pretty much confirms, you know, my suspicion is that there was a big change in the way he played because he was playing this other horn. And, you know, Coltrane was very serious about music. He was very serious about playing. Everything he did musically meant something. Everything he did musically was very purposeful, and everything had like a rhyme or reason to it, right? Most musicians, they pick up another instrument like a soprano. Like if I'm going to play soprano, I'm just going to screw around with it, and I'm going to play it on a couple gigs, and then I might decide I don't want to play it anymore. And it's not going to be that deep for me. But someone like Train was very deep with this stuff. He would, you know, he'd be stuck on the soprano, and he'd probably be kind of frustrated. He'd be like, well, you know, why am I doing this? You know, why is this happening and I'm not playing my tenor? And that's kind of what he's saying there, is that the soprano was changing something about his tenor, and he was feeling some ambivalence or he was having a question about it. And ultimately, you know, it's funny, what he said would happen did happen. He went back to the tenor. After 1965, I think Chim Chim Cheree on the John Coltrane Quartet plays, that's like the last time he plays soprano on like a studio record. Everything from there on out is all tenor, except for a couple alto recordings and a flute recording in 1967. But other than that, it's all tenor. And his tenor sound explodes over the course of 65 and then to the end of his life. His sound goes from being, you know, tight and squeezed to big and broad and lush and with a full vibrato and a full low register, and he's playing all the range of the horn in a way he hadn't for a while. You know, people associate Coltrane on tenor with the upper range of the tenor, and as he got toward the end of his life, that began to change. And I think this changed in like 64 with the Crescent record. He started going back to the tenor and exploring the tenor more. And I think what happened then is his sound just exploded. It grew so much, and you know, really, if you listen to the way he plays by the end of his life, it's very powerful the way he plays the tenor. Like if you listen to a Temple University concert, and I think he's even playing like a hard rubber mouthpiece, like maybe a Berg or a soloist. It's hard to tell from the pictures. I think it's a Berg. If I was going to bet on it, I think it's a Berg Larsen. But you know, Berg Larsens have a very broad sound and a very wide sound. If you put the right reed on it, you can get a lot of power and a lot of range. And that, I started listening to, you know, Jan Garbarek, who I think is someone who follows in the footsteps of Train tone-wise. You know, he plays a Berg, and he gets the same kind of broad tone. And this is all coming from a realization I had about the soprano and the way that the soprano kind of affected his playing. But, you know, I think it is interesting to kind of tie it all together, how for a while, you know, the two instruments were so unified in terms of tone, you know, because he was playing soprano so much that his embouchure was becoming more accustomed to the soprano. When he'd go to the tenor, he would kind of be trying to play like his soprano on the tenor. I think it's very interesting, and one of those things that, you know, I've been thinking about for a couple years. And you know, it's, what does it really do for me as a musician? It's tough to say, like, because I ended up practicing soprano a lot for a couple months, about 6 months, you know, back in 2023, and I ended up deciding, you know, maybe it's not for me. You know, I ended up getting to the point where I was like, you know, this horn is fun, but it's a big commitment, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that commitment. You know, you really do have to make it your total focus. And, you know, I didn't have a great horn. You know, my horn was kind of a crummy horn, and, you know, I just didn't want to mess with it. But, you know, to me, just discovering something about a musician you like is very important. And it did help me think about sound and how I thought about the tenor, and how I thought about, you know, I wanted to make my sound, you know, maybe also bigger and strengthen it more. And this was at the same time, if you watch my other video, where I was starting to apply more air, you know, my more air, more diaphragm pressure to my sound, and I was starting to get more of the sound that I liked. And, you know, I think these things had a lot to do with each other. So that's about all I have to say about that. I will catch you guys in the next video.